Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. Whispers on the Wind. The first time I heard it, I was alone in the garden, tending to my late mother's roses. It was a soft whisper, a gentle breeze that caressed the nape of my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. My name, Evelyn, was carried on the wind, so faint I almost convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But the unease settled deep in my bones, a gnawing sensation that something wasn't right. I glanced around, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the property, but there was no one there, just the tall, swaying trees and the endless stretch of the garden. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the loneliness that had wrapped itself around me since my mother's passing. The old house, filled with memories and echoes of a life that was now just dust and shadows, had become both a sanctuary and a prison. I hadn't left the estate in weeks, too consumed by the weight of grief and the responsibility of maintaining the property. My mother's roses were her pride and joy, and I had taken it upon myself to keep them alive, a final tribute to her meticulous care. Days passed, and the whispers grew more frequent. At first, it was only when I was outside, alone in the garden or walking along the edge of the forest that bordered the estate. The wind would pick up, and there it was again, Evelyn. A voice so soft, yet so distinct, like a lover's breath against my ear. It began to invade my thoughts, creeping into my dreams, until I found myself dreading the quiet moments when I was alone. I started to wonder if I was going mad, if the solitude had finally broken something inside me. One evening, as I was locking up the house, the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, rattling the old panes. I froze, the hair on my arms standing on end. The whisper was louder now, almost a hiss, my name repeated over and over. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway, but again, there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness and the creaking of the old house. I hurried to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it finally did, it was filled with nightmares of shadows and whispers that seemed to close in on me from all sides. By morning, the whispers had followed me inside. They echoed in the kitchen as I prepared breakfast, drifted through the sitting room as I dusted the old furniture, and even invaded the bathroom as I washed my face, the voice growing closer, more insistent. I could no longer deny that something was terribly wrong. I decided to speak with the only person I could think of who might understand, Father Michael, the priest who had officiated my mother's funeral. He was a kind man, always offering comfort in times of need, and I hoped he might have some explanation for the strange occurrences. That afternoon, I made my way to the small church on the outskirts of the village. The walk was long and the path overgrown, as if even the world outside the estate had been forgotten. The church was empty when I arrived, save for Father Michael, who was lighting candles at the altar. I hesitated, feeling foolish for even considering telling him about the whispers. But when he turned and saw the fear in my eyes, his expression softened. "What troubles you, child?" he asked, his voice a comforting balm against the storm brewing inside me. I hesitated, then finally confessed, "I keep hearing my name on the wind, Father. It's getting louder, closer, but no one is ever there." Father Michael's face grew serious, and he crossed himself before speaking. "The wind can carry many things, Evelyn. Some of them are best left unheard. You must be cautious, such whispers often herald something unnatural." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt the weight of the old house and its secrets pressing down on me, more suffocating than ever before. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Father Michael's warning haunted me as I walked back to the estate. His words circled in my mind like vultures, picking at my sanity. Something unnatural. I had always dismissed such notions as superstitious nonsense, the kind of talk meant to scare children and the gullible. But as I crossed the threshold into the house, I could feel it, an oppressive weight in the air, thick with something unseen but undeniably present. The whispers were no longer confined to the wind outside, they were within these walls, echoing through the corridors and rooms. That night, the house seemed more alive than ever, groaning under the weight of its age and the secrets it held. The whispers came and went in waves, sometimes so faint that I questioned my sanity, Other times so loud they felt like a scream just beyond hearing. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, but my concentration faltered, my hands trembling as I worked. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, seemed to carry my name. Evelyn. I sought refuge in my mother's study, a place that had always felt safe, even comforting. Her presence lingered there, in the neatly organized bookshelves and the soft glow of the lamp she had loved. As I sat at her desk, I noticed something I hadn't before, a small, leather-bound journal, tucked away in the corner. It was worn with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. My mother had never mentioned keeping a journal, and curiosity got the better of me. As I opened it, a wave of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing the lamp's flame. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to read. The entries were brief at first, mundane notes about the garden, the weather, and daily life. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting became frantic, the words scrawled across the page in a desperate, hurried manner. The whispers started again today. It's been years since I last heard them, but they're back. They're getting louder, closer. I can't escape them. I don't know what they want, but I'm afraid. Afraid of what they're telling me. My blood ran cold as I realized my mother had heard the same whispers. She had never spoken of them, never let on that she was haunted by the same eerie voice that now tormented me. The entries became more disjointed, filled with fear and confusion. She wrote of shadows that moved on their own, of cold spots that appeared without warning, of a presence that seemed to watch her from the darkness. I tried to tell Evelyn's father, but he wouldn't listen. He said I was imagining things, that the house was just old. But I know what I hear. I know what I see. And now they're calling for her. My sweet Evelyn. I have to protect her, but I don't know how. The whispers, they want her. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. The room felt colder than before, the shadows longer and darker. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what I had read. My mother had known something was after me, even before I was aware of it. She had tried to protect me, but from what? And why had she never told me? The whispers were no longer just an eerie phenomenon, they were a warning, a threat that had plagued my family for years. As I sat in the darkness, trying to make sense of it all, the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't just calling my name, they were speaking to me, in a language I couldn't understand, yet felt disturbingly familiar. The words wrapped around me like tendrils, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I stumbled out of the study, desperate to escape the oppressive presence that seemed to close in on me. I fled to the kitchen, hoping to find some solace in the mundane, but the whispers followed. They grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the walls, filling my head with their cursed chant. I could feel their breath on the back of my neck, cold and damp, as though something was standing right behind me. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing but the oppressive silence that followed the whispers, leaving me trembling and alone in the dark. In the distance, I heard a door creak open, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. My heart leaped into my throat. I wasn't alone here. Something else was in the house with me, something that had been waiting, biding its time. I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to the echoes of that door creaking open. My mind raced, filled with dread and uncertainty. The house had always felt like it had a life of its own, but now I was certain something was moving within these walls, something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. The whispers had led it to me, or perhaps it had been waiting all along, hidden in the shadows of this ancient house. With trembling hands, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a rusted kitchen knife. It was a feeble defense against whatever might be lurking, but it offered me a shred of comfort as I stepped cautiously toward the hallway. The house was eerily quiet now, the whispers having ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Each step I took felt heavy, the floorboards creaking underfoot as though protesting my movement. The hallway stretched out before me, a tunnel of darkness punctuated only by the faint light filtering through the stained glass windows. The door at the end of the corridor stood ajar, the one that had creaked open moments ago. I approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run as far from this place as possible. But something stronger, a dark curiosity perhaps, pushed me forward. I needed to know what was happening, needed to understand the whispers and the terror that had invaded my life. As I reached the door, I hesitated, the knife shaking in my hand. The room beyond was pitch black, a void that seemed to swallow the light. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and ragged, as I forced myself to step inside. The air was thick, heavy with a scent I couldn't place, something ancient and decaying. My foot brushed against something on the floor, and I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. Fumbling in the darkness, I reached for the light switch, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The light flickered on, revealing the room in all its decrepit glory. It was the old storage room, one I had rarely entered. Boxes were piled haphazardly in the corners, covered in dust and cobwebs, relics of a past long forgotten. But it wasn't the clutter that caught my attention, it was the figure standing in the far corner, barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall and thin, its body obscured by shadow. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze on me, piercing through the darkness. My first instinct was to flee, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But something kept me rooted in place, a morbid fascination mingled with sheer terror. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could hear the whispers again, louder now, filling the room with their insidious chant. "Who are you?" My voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. The figure didn't respond, but I could see it shift slightly, its form becoming more defined, as though it was stepping closer. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white, as the whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. And then, suddenly, it spoke, not with words, but with a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. The lights flickered, casting the room into brief moments of total darkness, each one feeling like an eternity. When the light returned, the figure was closer, just a few feet away from me now, its face still obscured by shadow. I stumbled back, panic surging through me. "Stay back!" I screamed, brandishing the knife in front of me. But the figure didn't stop. It advanced slowly, deliberately, the whispers now a cacophony of voices, each one calling my name with a sense of urgency and desperation. I backed up until I hit the wall, the cold surface a stark contrast to the heat of my terror. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. The figure loomed over me now, its presence suffocating, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to make it out of this house alive. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for me, biding its time. The whispers had been a lure, drawing me deeper into its trap, and now there was no escape. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the figure reaching out, its hand cold as death itself, and the whispers finally falling silent, as though they had achieved their goal. The world faded to black, and I was lost to the void. When I awoke, the world was different, darker, colder, as though the very essence of life had been drained from it. I was no longer in the storage room, I was lying on the cold stone floor of a chamber I didn't recognize. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, carved into the stone and glowing with a faint, eerie light. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of something dripping, slow and steady, like the ticking of a clock. I struggled to sit up, my body aching as though I had been beaten. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, and my mind was clouded, the memories of what had happened fragmented and hazy. I remembered the figure, the whispers, and the overwhelming sense of dread. But now, as I tried to piece together the events, it all felt distant, as though it had happened to someone else. And then I heard it, the whisper, soft at first but growing louder, closer, until it filled the chamber. "Evelyn." The sound of my name reverberated off the walls, echoing in a way that was both familiar and utterly terrifying. I scrambled to my feet, pressing myself against the cold stone, my eyes darting around the room for any sign of the figure, any escape. But there was no escape. The chamber had no doors, no windows, only the walls, covered in those strange symbols, pulsing with an unnatural light. The whispers swirled around me, forming words, phrases that I couldn't understand, but that filled me with an overwhelming sense of despair. I could feel something watching me, something ancient and malevolent, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. As I stood there, trembling, a part of the wall shifted, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a small, ornate box, its surface covered in the same symbols that adorn the walls. It was ancient, though it darkened with age, and as I approached it, I could feel a pulsing energy emanating from within. The whispers grew more intense, as if urging me to open it, to reveal the secret it held. My hands shook as I reached for the box, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to leave it untouched. But the whispers were relentless, driving me forward. As I lifted the lid, the chamber seemed to vibrate with a low hum, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter, almost blinding. Inside the box was an object wrapped in tattered cloth, and as I slowly unwrapped it, I felt a wave of cold wash over me, seeping into my bones. It was a mirror, small, cracked, and tarnished with age. But as I stared into it, I saw something that wasn't my reflection. The face staring back at me was twisted, contorted with agony and rage, the eyes burning with a malevolent fire. It was me, but not me, an echo of something darker, something that had been waiting, watching from the depths of that mirror for centuries. And then it spoke, not in whispers, but in a voice that shook the very foundation of the chamber. "You are mine, Evelyn. You always have been." The voice was a chorus of all the whispers I had heard, woven together into a single, terrifying entity. The reflection in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and I felt a cold, unyielding force pull at my very soul. I tried to look away, to break free from its grasp, but the mirror held me captive, its dark power overwhelming. I could feel myself slipping, being drawn into the depths of the glass, where shadows and whispers ruled, where light could never reach. The chamber around me began to fade, the symbols dimming as the mirror's pull grew stronger. Desperation surged through me, and I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, but it was no use. The reflection, that dark version of me, smiled with a twisted satisfaction as it dragged me into the abyss. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the mirror shattering, the pieces scattering across the chamber floor, each one reflecting the horror of what had just occurred. But even in the darkness, the whispers remained. They were louder now, echoing through the void, my name repeated over and over as if it was all that existed. Evelyn. The sound of my name became everything, surrounding me, suffocating me, until I realized that I was the whispers, and the whispers were me. I had become part of the darkness, part of the thing that had haunted me all along. And in that final, horrifying moment, I understood the truth. The whispers had never been calling me. They had been calling for me, drawing me to this place, to this fate, to become one with the shadows, to join the countless others who had been lured here before. The house, the figure, the mirror, it had all been part of the same monstrous entity, feeding on fear, feeding on souls. As the last shred of my consciousness faded into the darkness, the whispers finally ceased. The house stood silent, empty once more, waiting patiently for the next soul to wander too close, to hear their name whispered on the wind. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Wailing Flowers. When I first moved into the old Victorian house, I was captivated by its charm. The high ceilings, the intricate woodwork, and the heavy, ornate wallpaper that covered nearly every wall. The wallpaper, with its repeating pattern of crimson flowers, felt oddly familiar, like something I had seen in a dream or a memory I couldn't quite place. I remember running my fingers over the textured surface, tracing the delicate curves of the petals. It was beautiful, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. Perhaps it was the way the pattern seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it, or the way the colors seemed to deepen as the light faded in the evening. The first night in the house, I had trouble sleeping. The creaks and groans of the old structure, combined with the howling wind outside, made it hard to settle in. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. My eyes wandered to the wallpaper, faintly illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The flowers seemed different now, less like flowers and more like faces. I blinked, telling myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But no matter how many times I closed my eyes and reopened them, the faces remained, twisted in silent agony, their mouths open in soundless screams. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I approached the wall, needing to confirm that what I was seeing wasn't real. But as I drew closer, the faces seemed to grow more distinct, the flowers more grotesque. I reached out a trembling hand to touch the wallpaper, but before I could, a cold draft swept through the room, making me shiver. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I stepped back, startled, and the faces on the wallpaper seemed to leer at me, their expressions shifting into something more menacing. I stumbled back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a frightened child. I told myself it was just the house settling, the cold just a result of poor insulation. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, but the sense of being watched persisted. I could feel their eyes on me, the eyes of the wailing faces in the wallpaper. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for sleep, but it didn't come. Instead, I heard a soft whisper, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The voice was coming from the wall. "Help us," it said, barely more than a breath. I froze, too terrified to move. The whispering continued, growing louder, more desperate. "Please, help us." I couldn't take it anymore. I leaped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and fled the room, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night on the couch in the living room, the lights on and the television playing some mindless show at full volume to drown out the whispers. But even then, I could still hear them, faint but persistent, seeping through the walls like a poison. I knew, without a doubt, that something was terribly wrong with this house, and especially with that wallpaper. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that the events of the previous night were just a vivid nightmare brought on by the stress of moving. I avoided the bedroom, opting instead to throw myself into unpacking, hoping the mundane tasks would ground me in reality. The sun was shining brightly through the windows, casting warm light over the polished wood floors and giving the house a welcoming glow. It felt silly to think that a few strange shadows could frighten me so much. But as the day wore on, the uneasy feeling in my stomach refused to fade. My thoughts kept drifting back to the wallpaper and the faces that had appeared in the darkness. I wondered if maybe the pattern had always been there, hidden in the flowers, and I had simply failed to notice it until last night. The thought made my skin crawl. I decided to take a closer look, hoping to dispel my fears once and for all. Armed with a sense of determination, I returned to the bedroom. The room was bathed in daylight now, the wallpaper looking as innocent as ever. The crimson flowers were delicate and beautiful, arranged in an intricate pattern that seemed to flow like a river across the walls. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, running my fingers over the surface again. This time, there was no sign of the faces. Just flowers, as it should be. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned to leave the room, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A small, dark stain in the corner where the wallpaper met the floor. It was barely noticeable, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Kneeling down, I examined the stain more closely. It was a rusty brown color, like dried blood. My heart began to race again, and I instinctively recoiled, the memory of the whispered voices flooding back. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. I tried to distract myself with work, but my thoughts kept returning to the stain and the faces in the wallpaper. Who had lived in this house before me? What had happened here? I decided to do some research, hoping to find answers that would put my mind at ease. I started by searching online for any history of the house, combing through old records and news articles. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Several years ago, the house had been owned by a man named Edward Crane, a reclusive artist known for his dark and disturbing paintings. According to the reports, Crane had become obsessed with his work, spending days locked away in his studio, painting images of tortured souls and demonic entities. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house at all hours, but no one ever saw him. Then, one day, the noises stopped. When the police finally entered the house, they found Crane dead, his body surrounded by his paintings. But what was most disturbing was the wallpaper. Crane had covered the walls of his studio with it, and the pattern was identical to the one in my bedroom. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized what this meant. The faces in the wallpaper weren't just my imagination, they were Crane's work, his tortured visions captured in the walls of the house. And somehow, they were still here, trapped and screaming in silence. The whispers returned that night, more insistent and frantic than before. I could no longer deny what was happening. The house, or something within it, was alive, and it was trying to reach out to me. As I lay in bed, the voices grew louder, filling the room with their desperate pleas. "Free us," they cried. "Release us from this torment." I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, but I also felt a strange sense of responsibility. Whatever Crane had done, whatever evil he had unleashed, it was up to me to stop it. But how? How could I fight something that had no form, no physical presence, only a voice in the dark? As the night wore on, I made a decision. I would find a way to break whatever curse had been placed on the house, to free the souls trapped in the wallpaper. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already become a part of their nightmare, and that escaping it would be far more difficult than I could ever imagine. The following day, I decided to search the house for any clues that might explain Edward Crane's madness. I started in the bedroom, carefully inspecting every inch of the wallpaper for any hidden messages or symbols. But aside from the disturbing faces, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Frustrated, I moved on to the rest of the house, searching through drawers, closets, and every nook and cranny I could find. Hours passed, and my hope of discovering anything tangible began to wane. It wasn't until I ventured into the basement that I found something truly unsettling. The basement was cold and damp, with a faint smell of mildew that clung to the walls. The single light bulb overhead cast a dim glow, barely illuminating the space. I noticed a large, dusty tarp covering something in the far corner. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it, a sense of dread gnawing at my insides. With trembling hands, I pulled the tarp aside, revealing a large, ornate mirror. The mirror was cracked, the glass fractured in several places, but it was the frame that caught my attention. The wood was intricately carved with the same floral pattern as the wallpaper in my bedroom. As I looked closer, I realized that the flowers were actually tiny faces, twisted in agony just like the ones on the walls. My breath caught in my throat. This mirror was the key, it had to be. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out to touch the frame. As my fingers brushed against the wood, the room seemed to grow colder, the light dimming even further. I could see my reflection in the cracked glass, but something was wrong. My reflection wasn't quite right. The edges of my face seemed to blur, and behind me, in the reflection, the basement appeared darker, more menacing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I spun around, but the basement was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was gone. In its place was Edward Crane, his gaunt face twisted into a sneer, his eyes filled with madness. He was holding a paintbrush in one hand, dripping with blood. The sight of him sent a wave of terror through me, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over the tarp in my haste. But Crane's reflection didn't move. He stared at me through the mirror, his lips moving silently as if he were trying to speak. I forced myself to stay still, to focus on his lips, trying to decipher what he was saying. At first, it was just a whisper, a murmur that barely reached my ears. But then, the words became clearer. The mirror, the key, Crane's voice was faint, but there was an urgency to it. Break it, break the curse. I didn't need to be told twice. I looked around the basement for something to smash the mirror with, but before I could act, the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the air again, and the voices, the same voices from the wallpaper, filled the basement. They were screaming now, a cacophony of agony and despair. The mirror's glass began to ripple, as if it were made of water, and the reflection of Crane started to change, morphing into something far more terrifying. His face elongated, the features distorting into a monstrous visage. His eyes turned black, soulless voids that bore into me. The mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. The mirror began to tremble in its frame, the cracks widening as the demonic figure tried to push its way through. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy iron rod leaning against the wall, and swung it at the mirror with all my strength. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, fragments flying in every direction. The screams reached a fever pitch, then suddenly fell silent, leaving me in a deafening, oppressive quiet. I stood there, panting, surrounded by shards of glass. The mirror was destroyed, but the sense of dread hadn't lifted. If anything, the silence felt even more menacing, as if something was waiting, lurking just out of sight. My eyes darted around the basement, expecting to see Crane's monstrous reflection emerging from the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the broken mirror and the oppressive stillness. But I knew this wasn't over. I had done what Crane's reflection had told me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had merely scratched the surface of something far more sinister. The house was still alive with whatever evil Crane had unleashed, and breaking the mirror might have only made it stronger. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with what had happened in the basement. The house felt different now, heavier, as if the very air was thick with malice. I wanted to believe that smashing the mirror had ended whatever curse lingered here, but deep down, I knew better. The faces in the wallpaper were still there, and their whispers had grown louder, more frantic, as if the destruction of the mirror had only aggravated them. They were no longer begging for help, they were warning me. The next morning, I knew I needed answers. I couldn't stay in this house any longer, not without understanding what was really going on. I decided to visit the local library, hoping to find more about Edward Crane and the dark history of the house. The librarian, a kindly older woman, helped me locate a section on local history, and it wasn't long before I found what I was looking for, a dusty old tome with the name Crane scrawled in faded ink on the spine. As I flipped through the brittle pages, a grim picture began to emerge. Edward Crane wasn't just a painter, he was a man obsessed with the occult. The book detailed his descent into madness, driven by his search for power and immortality through dark rituals. He believed that by trapping souls in his paintings, he could harness their energy to achieve eternal life. The wallpaper in my bedroom wasn't just a decoration, it was his final masterpiece, a prison for the souls he had tormented and killed. The flowers were the faces of his victims, their agony immortalized in the walls. And the mirror I had broken? It wasn't the source of the curse, but rather a portal, a way for Crane to interact with the outside world even after his death. By shattering it, I hadn't freed anyone, I had merely released whatever was trapped on the other side. I left the library in a daze, the weight of my discovery pressing down on me. I felt like I was being suffocated by the very air around me. The sun was setting as I drove back to the house, the sky ablaze with fiery reds and oranges, but all I could think about was the darkness waiting for me inside. I knew I couldn't stay here, but I also couldn't just leave. The souls trapped in the wallpaper deserved peace, and I couldn't live with myself knowing I had walked away. When I arrived home, the house was deathly quiet. The air inside was cold, almost freezing, and the lights flickered ominously as I made my way to the bedroom. I hadn't heard the whispers since leaving the library, but now they returned, louder than ever, filling the room with their anguished cries. The wallpaper was writhing, the faces twisting and contorting as if trying to break free from their floral prison. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed by fear and guilt. I didn't know how to help them, how to break the curse that held them captive. The book had mentioned that Crane's power was tied to a root, something buried deep within the house that anchored his evil to this world. If I could find it and destroy it, maybe, just maybe, I could end this nightmare. But I didn't know where to start. The house was vast, with too many hidden corners and dark spaces. As I stood there, trying to gather the courage to move, the voices changed. They weren't just crying out anymore, they were speaking to me, guiding me. Downstairs, they whispered, their voices a mix of hope and fear. Underneath. I followed their lead, my feet moving on their own as I descended the stairs to the basement. The oppressive cold grew worse with every step, and the air seemed to pulse with a dark energy. I reached the basement, the shattered remains of the mirror crunching underfoot, and the voices became more insistent. "Here," they urged. "Beneath the earth." I grabbed a shovel from the corner and began to dig. The dirt was hard and unyielding, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades, but I kept going, driven by the voices and the desperate need to end this once and for all. After what felt like an eternity, the shovel struck something solid. I cleared the dirt away and uncovered a small, ornate box, covered in the same floral pattern as the wallpaper. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a lock of hair, brittle with age, and a small, blood-stained knife. This was it, the root of Crane's power, the relics he had used to bind the souls to his will. Without hesitation, I took the knife and plunged it into the lock of hair, severing the last connection to Crane's evil. The moment I did, the house erupted in a deafening scream, the voices of the trapped souls rising to a crescendo before abruptly falling silent. The air grew warmer, the darkness lifting as if a weight had been removed. I could feel the house exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for far too long. I left the basement in a daze, the box still clutched in my hand. The wallpaper in the bedroom was still, the faces gone, replaced by the original floral pattern. The curse had been broken, the souls freed from their torment. But as I stood there, staring at the now innocuous wallpaper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, something that had been released when I shattered the mirror. I turned to leave, but before I could step out of the room, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from the walls. "Thank you." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice wasn't one of the tortured souls I had freed. It was darker, deeper, familiar. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach as I saw it, a faint outline in the wallpaper, barely visible in the fading light, but unmistakable. It was Crane's face, smiling. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.